Ladies and gentlemen, can everyone hear all right? Great. So we'd like to thank everyone for coming this morning. We're going to try and start on time because we've got quite a full schedule and we're oversubscribed, so there are people downstairs. And I would just like to point out that this morning's event is public, it's on the record, and it is being live streamed. So if anyone wants to have access to this afterwards, there is a link up on the website. Please do join us. Now, thank you all for coming. My name is Miret Mobrouk, and I'm a senior fellow and the director of the Egypt Studies program at MEI. And this morning's discussion is on the evolving nature of Egypt's economy. Egypt has made great strides with economic reforms over the past few years. They've been great. The macro picture is very, very good. But the feeling is that if the country wants to move beyond short-term gains, the growth model will have to change slightly, and the private sector is really going to have to push to become the growth model in the country. So we're very, very lucky this morning. We've taken advantage of a visit by the American Chamber of Commerce's biannual delegation, a door-knock visit, and we've got 4 people who are quite uniquely positioned to tell us something about Egypt's private sector. I'm going to start off from the left. Mr. Girgis Abdishahid is a lawyer. What we will be doing is taking a holistic look at Egypt's market sector. So Mr. Abdishahid will be here to discuss legal developments, the legalese of doing business or not of doing business, Egypt's international arbitration and international legislation. Delia Wahba on my left, whom I've actually known for many years, is again uniquely positioned to talk about startups because she started up her own business over 25 years ago, and she will be discussing human development, labor, technology, EOT. Over on my right, we have Mr. Tariq Tawfiq, who is currently the president of the American Chamber of Commerce. Tariq will be taking a more macro look at the entire economy, taking a look at macro gains, investment, and we'll be asking him about the recent austerity measures. And last and by no means least, Ms. Sara Al-Battuti, who again founded her own firm called Eco Consult, and she'll be leading us through the environmental challenges that Egypt is going to face. It's probably not endemic to Egypt, but we'll be looking at the environmental challenges, the challenges posed by climate change, sustainability in a country where the population is booming, to say the least, and placing strains on our resources. So what we're going to do is kick off with a panel discussion to start with. I'll be asking a few questions. We'll be having a discussion among the panel, and then we will open it up for questions. There are people around with mics for when you ask questions. Please just stand so that we can see you. And please just, let us know who you are. And if we could keep them to questions rather than comments, that would be fantastic because there are a lot of people here. So thank you so much. So I'm going to start with Tariq. Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate your taking the time out of a really busy schedule. So Tariq, Egypt's macro numbers are good. It's been working on its reform the past few years. The past 2 years, actually, have shown huge improvements in the macro numbers. It's doing well on the IMF program. However, those improvements, that reform has come at a cost. Egypt is undergoing austerity measures, and those reforms have hit Egypt's middle classes the most. Now, we're going to have to continue growing. How do you think we're going to be able to move forward with growth, with employment, with new policies that will ensure equitable growth for the country?
Well, good morning, everybody. I just want to say that it's not only austerity. I mean, so much has been happening on the ground. Bear in mind, 4 years ago, I mean, the infrastructure of the country was run down. Tourism was at its lowest. No power generation, power cutoffs, no transferability of currency, decadence of governing structure that has been decaying for 60 years. We've been going through a period of neglect, and the accumulation of these problems, just attacked the whole country, notably after 2011, So, I mean, to come and rectify the situation overnight is almost an impossibility. So, and talking about investments at large, investments wouldn't come unless you have a kind of an infrastructure that would support investments, stability, security, an appetite for a legislative reform, governance reform. And I have to say that over the last 4 years, we have witnessed an unprecedented level of reform. Infrastructure, I would just like to mention that 7,000 kilometers of roads were rebuilt in the country. 670 bridges are being built or have been built. New ports have been built and expanded. Close to 7 airports are being built. The capacity of power generation has doubled in 2 years. And this without which, I mean, you wouldn't even think of investing in a country at large. So this is a basic statement, let alone, addressing the ailments that have been politically untouchable for the last 60 years, primarily the subsidy reform that has been dragging the country to a constant deficit. This year, and this is a very interesting indication, for the first time in 15 years, we have a primary surplus in the budget. Despite the spending, despite the programs that I'm going to mention in a minute, this primary surplus is basically by rationalizing the government expenditures and directing them to where they should be. Let alone, when we talk about austerity, there have been several programs that impacted the needy, the less to do, cash handouts to about 2.3 million families, conditional cash handouts, a program that has been designed with the World Bank, pensioners that have cash handouts out of the pension system, close to 1 million families, rationalization of the bread subsidy, the ration cards, the increase in the takeaway of pensioners by close to 70–80% over the last 3 or 4 years. I mean, in this respect, I mean, there has been a very dramatic approach for the first time to address the least to do in the country. Let alone, the sense of stability and security within the mindset of the Egyptian layman and the job creation that took place over the last 3 years. Tourism is back, and tourism is a direct reflection of a sense of safety and security in the country. Egypt has been polled to be the 16th safest country in the world, ahead of the United States and England, So, I mean, this perception of a visitor impacts tourism. Tourism, we have 2.5 million jobs are back. And this is, again, one of the outcomes. So when we talk about the needy and austerity, we have to see the reflection of the reform on jobs created along with the programs that were taking place. Construction, and this is one of the areas that has been pulling the economy, has been growing at a rate of 14%. And this is basically employing probably the lowest level of the population, So, I mean, the general perception at large, apart from the reform and the macros that everybody can check, I mean, I don't need to talk about it, unemployment going down from 14% to 8.9%. Again, this is something to reckon with, So what I'm trying to say at large, what has been done, maybe when we look at it, we have been going on a very fast track. And during this fast track of reform, whether that has to do with infrastructure, legislations, policy reforms, there are still so many glitches in the way, I mean, an accumulation of problems that have accumulated over 6 years are not going to be solved overnight. So when we look at the big picture, we cannot pick and choose. We just have to see where we were 4 years ago, where we are today, and then we have to project where will we be in another decade. From our perspective as a business community, I think we are very positive because we see the political will of the government to continue the reform aspect with all its dimensions, Reform in this country, like I mentioned earlier, is not confined to policy or legislative reform. Now we are at a stage of implementation, and this is the biggest challenge. The red tape, the bureaucracy that has been creeping through the arteries of the country over the last so many years is the biggest challenge. So, I mean, we're more or less satisfied with the reform agenda that has been, or the legislations and the policies. The implementation part is really the biggest challenge. I just don't want to take too much time. Stop me when I can.
Because this is actually one of the things that I was going to, you mentioned improvements and glitches. So maybe if you can just hit a little bit more on the improvements and especially on the glitches, because the glitches are what everyone is going to have to move beyond to achieve growth. And when we discuss job creation, yes, it's up, but how many jobs? I mean, Egypt says it wants to grow at about 6%. How many jobs would we need to create to be able to grow at about 6% annually? Where are we now? And which areas of the market do you think we will be able to expand job creation in?
Well, as a rule of thumb, I mean, we have a population growth, which is a big challenge. This is one other glitch that we have of close to 2.5%, which is not sustainable. Yeah. So in order to create employment, in conjunction with this population growth, you have to grow at 7.5%. Yes. Which is 3 times as much. Yes. We're still in the range of 5 to 6%. But on another note, we have to look at the picture because the private sector, and this is a pre-qualification of the statement, private investment have been more or less at some point in time suspicious. Prior to the reform agenda, everybody was holding back. No power, no transferability of currency, no reform, so I mean, it was like more or less going down the drain. And then the reform agenda took place on a very aggressive pace. Everybody was apprehensive whether that would result into social unrest or not. So everybody held back again. Now, at the time, when everybody was comfortable enough that the reforms worked and, things are politically stable, we had the emerging market crisis, and then investments was held back again, So, I mean, it was a bit unfortunate. So now we are at a stage, where we are jump-starting the economy from a private perspective. What happened during this period is that the government, was a bit apprehensive, and they started jumping into filling certain gaps in the economy by pushing the infrastructure, and by pushing, and mainly, I mean, the government spending over the last 3 years has been the biggest growth contributor to the economy. We are seeing a transformation right now. I mean, bear in mind, I'll just give you some figures. Private sector investment a couple of years ago was close to 45%, and the government was 55%. This is the lowest ever. As we speak today, this year, it's going to be 55% private sector and 45% government. The average that we would expect over the coming 2-3 years would be 70% private sector and 30% government expenditure. So that would be the normal or the expected growth. We are seeing it moving in this direction. And this, talking about job creation is, Egypt is a very diversified economy, and we have to be careful. We cannot just look at the Middle East and say the Middle East. Egypt is a very unique case in the region. It's the one country that is not dependent on oil. It's the one country that is an agrarian society or economy. The diversity of the economy is unlike any other country in the whole area. So, I mean, in this respect, we're talking about industry, agriculture, logistics, mining, gas, oil, I mean, you name it. I mean, it's not a single entity can control this economy. In another note, this has been characterized by informality. 50% of the economy is informal. And the informality in this country is not characterized by black money. It's just basically entrepreneurs who want to make a living, and they just have to circumvent the red tape, and they just go informal to make a living. And now there is a big attempt, to change the SME laws to create incentives for small and medium-sized enterprises, to pardon them for any prior taxes, to give them incentives for investment, for formalization. And I think this will be another platform to build on, because the core force in the whole economy are SMEs. 95% of establishments in the countries are SMEs. So, I mean, in this respect, we are seeing a very positive trajectory when it comes to that. I mean, even when it comes to foreign direct investment, we're seeing foreign direct investments in the, usual suspects: gas, energy, infrastructure, medium size, and this entails the biggest companies. When we talk about small and medium-sized investors from abroad, they will not come until we unclog the arteries of the country, which is the biggest challenge that we have right now.
Okay, so we can continue on with this for a bit, but we want to move on. But I will come back to the informal sector and formalization and the size of the state sector in a bit. But if I can move on to Delia, because Tariq raised a very, very important point when talking about labor. Now, for growth, you need capital, labor, and technology. And you sort of deal with two of those, labor and technology. In Egypt, cheaper labor is often held up as an advantage, but very often that cheaper labor is cheaper for a reason, and it isn't that well educated. So it's a bit of a rut. How are we, I mean, is there a plan to move this forward? Is there a plan to improve the labor pool?
Thank you very much, Mira. I don't know if it's working?
Yes.
Okay. No?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here today. Basically, I'm going to talk today about Egypt and where we stand today at this front, because human development is really instrumental to all what Tariq spoke about. Okay, this is the oil of Egypt, and this is where we can bring value and create the growth that we're looking for. So again, we're dealing with this with the premise of short-term solution needs to happen as well as long-term solutions. So we cannot ignore that this is something that's we need to equip the labor force immediately to join to meet to the economic growth that's happening in new sectors in Egypt, like the renewable energy, among others, as well as to at the same time and the technology and what's going on in this world, and at the same time with long-term whole reform for what we call technical vocational education and training in Egypt, okay? And the one thing that's really important to note here is this is done in partnership with the private sector. The government is not doing this alone, okay? So when we're designing a new curriculum or new training or new certification of teachers, this is done in very much close coordination with the private sector to make sure that we're meeting the market demand, okay? So if I zoom in a bit on the technical vocational education training, this is done, we're doing things from scratch, curriculum development, teachers training. Unfortunately, yes, we have been working in this for a long time, but now there's a lot of innovation that is required in this sector, and it's happening today in partnership with the private sector. And the private sector is even, now investing in such kind of program. They're establishing academies and schools to train labor, the low-skilled labor, to send them in the market and introduce them to the market. So this is done in a very systematic manner to solve on a short-term basis and a long-term basis.
So let me ask you something. By the way, I'm just going to interrupt. For everyone standing, we've got a room downstairs that is set up with the live streaming if it's going to be more comfortable, just to let everyone know. It's downstairs on the right. So in vocational training. To date, Egypt has not had the success with these programs that it should have. Mm-hmm. So what's happening differently?
Okay.
I think this is the thing.
I think the private sector partnership is what's happening different, because we're meeting the real demand of the private sector. This is what's happening. I'm telling you, to the extent that the private sector is investing now in academies, in training, because the private sector will never invest unless they see the value of bringing, doing this business and the return on the investment in such sector, right? Mm-hmm. So this is one thing that we need to put into consideration. The second thing is that there is, again, they are establishing today sort of accreditation bodies and certification bodies to make sure that those programs are sustainable, are carrying on beyond the, like the kickoff phase or the initiation phase, that there are networks of curriculum developers that are existing, well-trained, qualified by international standard, and Egyptians, of course, that are qualified and living in Egypt. So this is, like, again, another approach to make sure it's sustainable and it's beyond such programs. So the private sector engagement, as well as the making sure that there are bodies that are existing beyond the programs. So this is one thing, okay? The second thing that I would like to touch base on, because it's the key enabler for any, any country at such a trajectory, is the digital society. This is something that's important and critical to create, efficiency. It can contribute to cutting red tape, as Tariq was saying. This is key for eliminating corruption. It's important for youth employment, and Egypt is really has huge, number and has huge potential of high quality young people that we export even to the world. We export a lot of people from this sector. This is a sector where private sector engagement is instrumental, and it's actually a private sector, sector that's it's growing based on the private sector. There's a lot of partnership with international companies operating in Egypt, like the Microsofts and the IBMs and the SAPs, that are helping this sector move on. So this is, again, a key enabler for a 21st century country and moving on. So we're investing a lot in this sector, and again, with the private sector contribution. So this is the second important point that I want to highlight. The third point is entrepreneurship. Again, looking at the demographics of Egypt and the 60% youth, and as you mentioned, the amount of jobs that are need to be created every year, there is a whole transformation in the ecosystem to support entrepreneurship in Egypt. So one, there is a lot of associations and organizations that are helping instill the entrepreneurship and risk-taking and principles in schools, doing a lot of initiatives at the school levels. The higher education system is introducing, of course, a lot of incubation platform as well as innovation platforms to help unleash the creative potential of the young people in Egypt. So this is another a systemic change that's happening in the ecosystem of entrepreneurship. The third thing is there are a lot of, business regulatory, and maybe Girgis can speak a bit further about it, which is promoting, very incentivizing the young entrepreneurs that are joining the business market with the low interest rates, or incentivize them for tax breaks and the like. So there's a lot of investment in adjusting this ecosystem to help creation of, because a lot of youth, again, and in Egypt, I think is one of the largest countries, they go to entrepreneurship as a substitute, as a necessity, instead of 50%. It's estimated at 50% that the young people go for an entrepreneurship as a mean for employment out of necessity rather than out of. But again, you need to create the platform for that and the different systems for that. I need to just to highlight one thing at the end. I don't know if I covered all the points that you want me to address, but there is a lot about women as well that I can go into. It's an unending story. So it's again, of course, yes. So you want me to address it now?
I do. Well, now would be great, because I'm going to ask you a couple of, two things. One, you were talking about vocational education, and generally speaking, female participation in technical vocation has been very low. But as a whole, female labor participation in Egypt is very low, with about half of unemployed women having university educations and up. So that's a huge cost to the economy. So why is that? And how do we is this something that you think you can be tackled? But also, I mean, you mentioned the technical sector and that we exported a lot of young people. Well, are you worried about brain drain in any way? Okay. So let me just quickly
Sure.
because
Okay, I don't want to. So regarding women, so yes, I agree that we have a challenge, but don't forget the informal sector in Egypt.
Yes.
Okay, it's a huge, absorption of women being employed in the informal sector. Of course, this does not mean that we have to incentivize them to join the formal sector. So this is one thing. The second thing, yes, but again, there is a lot of for example, banks now today give loans to women by 5%, especially for women-owned business, with a very low interest rate. It's part of the mechanism that's being established in Egypt to promote women in business. So there are a number of initiatives that are happening today, to help the empowerment of women and bringing them into a mainstream, business. As you know, it's in Egypt and all over the world, the percentage of women participation, again, is quite challenged, yes, Egypt is lower in relation to the rest of the world, but there are a number of, that don't forget that certain industries like the one Tariq mentioned, like the agribusiness and the education, are one of the largest sectors that are absorbing the largest number of women. So as those sectors grow, potentially the women engagement and participation, and these are one of the most growing sectors in Egypt, the education and the agriculture sector, okay? As well the health. For the brain drain, yes, but this has been happening, and it's hard to deny that this has been happening for the last 4 years. However, we're seeing them coming back, and this is as of today, I already experiencing in my life, 20 of them bringing, coming back to Egypt and establishing, whether joining in startups or establishing, partnering with others. You have a lot of, Egypt was lucky as well, but having a lot of multinational companies that employed a lot of executives that went all over the world and were promoted and trained, and now they are coming back to Egypt and setting their own business as well, or coming back and partnering with others. So this is, we're seeing, because again, a growth of 5.3% and an aspiration for 6%, and what's happening all over the world in terms of, growth rates and all this. So this is actually attracting, we have a good story that's helping attract. Yes, we suffered from it a few years back, but again, we're seeing a comeback, sort of a flow of, again, from the region as well, specifically, and with what's going on. So I just want to highlight a couple of things, okay? Sure. First of all, we have a lot of complex problems in this. So it's really taking us time, and especially when you speak about human development, this is something that cannot happen, overnight, okay? It requires time. We're work in progress. Okay, we have to handle it with short-term solutions and longer-term solutions, because there are a lot of systemic change that needs to happen for whole sectors. Of course, sometimes we as private sector are challenged with the pace of how it's moving. But again, we have to think creatively and look at new ways of how to resolve it for short-term solutions. So we're still work in progress. Egypt is work in progress when it comes to human development.
Okay. I used to have a professor who used to say, whatever it is you're doing, do it faster. Yes, so this is all right. So on ease of business, it brings us straight into your expertise. Now, Egypt's, on the ease of doing business score, Egypt's actually gone up almost 3 points from last year. But it's still maybe not the easiest country in the world to do business for some reasons. Now, it has improved. It's strengthened minority investor protections. It's strengthened availability of credit. It's done a lot of work. But still, can you maybe just sort of talk us through what it's like for a small investor trying to set up business in Egypt, because of course, as we just pointed out, it's 95% of the market, but also for larger international investors, that there have been concerns. I mean, everyone remembers the Spanish gas arbitration deal, which Egypt is going to settle basically by exchanging gas. But it does sort of put up little red marks for people wanting to do business. So where do we stand on that? How is Egypt going to move on that?
Okay. Once again, thank you for hosting us here, and thank you for all for coming on Friday at 9 a.m. I want to start by a note that Dalia said that people are coming back, so we're finding our friends actually coming from the Gulf back to Egypt, and unlike what happened in the 70s and the 80s when there were a lot of Egyptians who worked in the Gulf came to Egypt with a lot of the conservative ideas. Now the people coming back are coming with modern ideas like brunch and keto and stuff like that, which is quite strange for our market. But anyways, on a serious note, I've actually now flipped my presentations and starting up with startups.
Okay.
Egypt is actually, like it or not, a hub for startups in the Middle East. The pace of Egyptians or ideas in Egypt is actually outgrowing the legislative market. If Egypt doesn't move fast, we'll lose these ideas in terms of structuring to our neighboring countries like the Gulf, where they actually capture them, incubate them, and help them structure legally for the first tranches of financing, and this is quite important. But the ideas are there. Like we have statistics from one of our DORNAC members here saying that Egypt has now introduced tablets in schools, but and they were completely encrypted by IBM and the Samsung. But after 3 hours, they managed to play Fortnite on it. So we have the talent in Egypt, and this talent has to stay there. And this is only by legislation. So this is where startups happen, and there are very good private sector initiatives, and if there are public sector initiatives, I'll leave this to Tariq to talk about them. But the private sector initiatives are actually great, and a lot of success stories are coming out of Egypt. There has been a lot of amendments to Egyptian laws in the past 9 years or so. However, I'm interested in 3. And if these 3 succeed and the Egyptian government do them well, I think Egypt will move a significant move. And it's not only for big companies. The embarking in the process of market liberalization in terms of electricity and gas, and then the licensing law. These 3 laws, if they were implemented in the right way, Egypt will go into a different direction. Electricity, Egypt has discovered that they might be a good transporter, nothing else. Like the example of the Suez Canal, taking it from Tariq. Egypt now is thinking of only being the grid to move electricity or gas from point A to point Z. Yet, electricity is still, and there are people here that can correct me in the market, the main buyer of electricity is the Egyptian government. However, there is no problem in having market-to-market or private-to-private sale, and this is what the laws will allow soon. And same thing with gas. And we're not talking about the mega projects here, because I can have a small power plant on the rooftop of my house, and actually, when I have abundance of electricity, I can sell it on the grid, and someone buys it from me. So these are opportunities only by liberalizing a market that we have, and the infrastructure is there.
Very quick question.
Sure.
How far away is the market from something like that?
No, we're still the main off-taker is the government in the bigger project. However, there are now rooftops with solar panels and selling it to the grid.
Yes.
Okay.
And so we are there. The first project of actually exporting and transporting gas on the private-to-private sector market is actually happening now, and it's going to be very soon, like in June or at least in 2019. So we are very close. Licensing law. Licensing law, the big companies can appoint the good lawyers and get them all the licenses that they want.
Okay.
However, it's all about the SMEs who need to do it themselves and go to the organization, run after licenses. So we have, Mr. Abu Ali, how many licenses that we need? Like 50 in order to have a company now, or an industrial project. So if we manage to downsize the licenses to 1 or 2, this will take Egypt to a completely different level. And definitely this will help the SMEs and the startups. So with the amendment of the SME law, that will help them in terms of taxation and the like. Licensing will definitely take them to a different direction, and we will manage to keep them in Egypt rather than anywhere else. Now going to the, one last thing on this point is the cyber laws. Again, the conservative Egypt starts with a very strict law because the drafters are concerned in many ways. However, to our surprise, that the involvement in the dialogue with the private sector has been instrumental in most of the amendments that the Egyptian government has been doing. So you find the Googles, the IBMs, the Facebook are actually talking with the government about their concerns about the draft laws that are being introduced, and there are actual amendments that happen because of the involvement and the dialogue with the private sector. So we are actually impressed by this, and this never used to happen in Egypt. So involvement of the private sector in the macroeconomic decisions is quite remarkable in the past couple of years. Now, going to disputes and arbitration, and I want to take a view of the judiciary first, because I believe judiciary is an infrastructure that is very important for economic progress. Without a stable and balanced and speedy judicial process, an investor might not want to come to a country. I will not talk about the judges. We have the most exceptional judges in the Middle East. Actually, we're exporting judges around us. So the Egyptian judicial mind in Egypt is stable. However, it's the process that is of the investors' concern. We have a concern in enforcement. We have a concern in the speed of the process. And then what is sometimes not realized is that you can file the case and it's very cheap, but actually to enforce the case takes you up to 7.5% of the award that you have to upfront it so that you start getting your money.
What about transparency?
In the judicial process? No, transparency is there, like lawyers advocate, and I'm a commercial and business lawyer here. So I don't see a problem in transparency. I see the main particular problems is in the speed and enforcement process.
Okay.
When we go to arbitrations, Egypt could have easily done a Venezuela move and decided that they will cancel all of their BITs and close themselves in, and if you're an investor, you're stuck in the Egyptian judiciary. But on the contrary, Egypt continued to expand their BITs, bilateral investment treaty signing. They respect them. And actually, although I'm an investor's lawyer, Egypt's track record in winning cases is very high. So Egypt still manages to win their cases. Yes, the sea gas and the like are there, but they keep the process. And this is a mode or a sign of confidence that to investors that while we are a developing country, we might screw up in some certain decisions. You have a process internally and internationally through the ICSID or through the BITs. And this has been quite remarkable and comforting to investors. So, and we've seen them now that the investors actually learned their lessons by doing the structuring, which was usually on a tax point of view. They now think of the treaty structuring. If I come to Egypt now, what is the best treaty so that serves me well as an investor? So I look maybe like I do my holding company in Holland or the like, so that I come to Egypt comfortably. And these signs, we've not seen it disencouraged by the Egyptian government, and in fact, they fight hard. And they have been very successful in out-of-court settlements.
All right, I have questions, but I'm going to pass it on to Sarah because I'm very conscious that people will have questions. Sarah, thank you for coming today. 100 million and growing. It was 100 million last time I checked. It's probably gone up since breakfast. how is Egypt now, considering the pressures that climate change is going to place on the entire region, not just on Egypt, considering water shortages, considering the fact that Egypt wants to continue to grow and continue with these big infrastructure projects, how sustainable is all this? And what's being done to ensure that, it is still sustainable?
Okay, well, I'm going to take the conversation well, thank you for having me here, and good morning, of course. I'm going to take the conversation into just shifting it slightly into the quality of that growth. Okay. How will we assume that growth? It took about 70 years for countries to sit down together and agree on the definition of what is sustainable development. I don't think we've got the 70 years. There's a pressing need for people to move on. And in short, without, definitions, etc., it's just the ability to get what needs to be done now without making the future have an issue when they need to get what needs to be done. So that requires two things. Sustainable development in any country requires, the first thing, the ability to assess what's on the ground. Mm-hmm. And the second thing is to plan for the future. And sometimes the future is unknown. Mm-hmm. Now, in the Middle East, we haven't had in recent modern history the ability for the planning simply because every 10 years there's a war or a breakout of complete unrest in the region. So it's been difficult to plan and move ahead smoothly and start like a project, start seeing this cycle, because that cycle is continuously interrupted. But on the other positive note, it's made Middle Easterns adapt quite well. They've got this, and some countries more than others, that they're able to address certain changes with a little bit more flexibility. They've become athletes in this. This is something I think that Egypt is beginning to look into in a very interesting way. Because if we look at one thing, climate change and environment have not really been high on the agenda for Egypt for quite a while. The stakeholders simply did not know what were the opportunities and the challenges posed. But today there's a different language happening in Egypt, especially on the climate policy. Egypt signed the Paris Agreement, which means that we will have to start beginning to look into various industries, transport, energy, agriculture, and now also they're looking at housing because this is the largest and fastest growing sector. But the one thing that was able to make climate and environment go high on the agenda is the language of how we consume, what we consume, and why we're doing this. Finally, policymakers are looking into behavior. Mm-hmm. So there's some very interesting things that you can look at. Why do we consume? What happens with this, spike in consumption in Egypt? We consume for various reasons. There's a population growth. There's a demand for fast economic growth, manufacturing industry, and that's fast-scale unemployment. There's also diversification with how are you growing, in which sectors you're growing. And the other thing is it's lack of awareness, lack of R&D in that field, and also fear and political uncertainty. They do two things. They increased population, and I don't know, but that's just the pattern. Whenever there is fear and uncertainty, there is a boom in population, which means you have to meet these demands. The second thing is they also cause sporadic consumption, which is very difficult for policymakers to read. So Egypt has been on a platform of several different ministries talking to the private sector that have access to this kind of information and analysis, and NGOs to try and understand why do we consume energy the way we consume energy, and why do we consume water that way? So all of these components have managed to get some information which is that we can link to the economic patterns in Egypt. The first thing is because it was subsidized. Mm-hmm. The subsidization of energy and water created very strange and regressive patterns in how we consume. We're a poor country. It's very interesting that 60% of Egypt's waste is organic waste. So what do we do about that? It's very strange that in time of fear and poverty, the energy spikes are going up. So the country wants to increase incomes, increase a better quality of life, but at the end of the day, you know that that comes hand in hand with increased use of energy, and you know that comes hand in hand with water usage, and we've got that issue. So the intellectual and academic efforts going into this have been missing, and it's very important. There's a big conversation with academia, with the NGOs, and with the private sector to try and understand, because at the end of the day, the growth that we are all talking about and the politics that we are talking about are about people. You've got this massive amount of people, and you need them to grow, but you need the quality of life to grow in that sort of direction. So this was very important. The idea as well that the same policy that we're talking about people and how people live their lives is an issue of national security.
Yes.
So now you've got two polar kind of languages, and they're meeting in the policy. My concern over the national policy, the national security of Egypt's water resources can be raised in various different languages and in various different settings as well. And we need to take advantage of that. The other thing is that with the sustainable growth, there has been a huge employment sort of absorption in Egypt because there was an influx of incoming labor from the Middle East after the Arab Spring that we have to absorb. You also have a lot of workforce which is young, 60% of Egypt is young, and you've got to get them employment. Now, the question is, how does this employment become sustainable in the long run? And the answer to that is diversifying the types of employment. So you need to create diversification where it's not, specific sectors that are where it's not only in agriculture, it's not only this. You need to change the mindset that everybody has to be an engineer or a doctor. There are many fields in Egypt that don't have Egyptians filling them. And, we were talking yesterday about this idea of having Egyptologists come from France. Why? Let's get the Egyptians to do the Egyptology. They overcome the linguistic barriers and it's cheaper. There are just these things that haven't been around in the conversation. Why are certain, companies operating only near cities when now there's a huge effort in getting infrastructure outside of Cairo and Alexandria and the main cities? So that's the thing. It's about the expertise that needs diversification to create markets around people to enter into the academic world, and then after that enter into different fields. And there's so much in Egypt to be explored. The second thing is diversifying the market, so it's not just tourism. Within every sector, there has to be the environmental idea. Egypt's protectorates are of huge interest right now. And the ecotourism, the agriculture, the fields of agriculture, you have a lot of young professionals now moving into independent farming, which is a very interesting kind of thing. Getting women to enter the market is very, very important, because when it comes to environment and climate change, women are the most vulnerable groups, simply because they don't have the ability, when their environmental circumstances change, they can't pick up and leave. It's the men that leave. So this is another sector that we have to look into. Currently, Egypt has been in talks about developing a climate policy that is relevant to where Egypt geographically is on a political level. So we're talking about a climate policy with a shared vision with the GCC countries, and one also that is relevant to Africa. So the first thing that on the Egyptian policy that was declared is that the vision for climate change should be centered around people. It's about the quality of the life of the average Egyptian. To create adaptation and mitigation strategies for the vulnerable areas of Egypt, which are the ones that are not provided with energy, and coastal areas. And the second thing is to identify partners in the private sector that can come into this with their operations. There's a huge effort. At AmCham, we are also, spearheading the effort with environmental impact, and the conversation is open, and there's massive interest in this within many, many companies in Egypt. And the final thing that I just wanted to add is that this conversation of sustainability and the nexus between economic, social, and and environmental issues is fairly new to the region. We're still testing it, but quite quickly I'm quite impressed that we've managed to get on top of things, on top of the climate change conversation, on top of developing green building codes for Egyptians by Egyptians that are affordable. You know, it's very difficult to try and convince stakeholders to come in, because in Norway they've done buildings using algae to produce their energy. I mean, how do you just explain, you know, the adoption of this? So it has to be local, it has to be relevant, and you have to make it fit the size. Do you know?
Quick question before we open it up. On the building, and I mean, on this last subject, how clued is both the government and the private sector into taking these issues into account? I mean, I'm still thinking of all these coastal resorts and villages that are still throwing up these big condominiums and areas without desalination while tapping groundwater and, dear God, building golf courses.
Yep.
Is there a sea change, or is this still...
On the policy level, they're not tapped into it, but simply because, and that's a very honest answer, they're not tapped into it yet, because you didn't have the legislation that provides a kind of platform, you didn't have the academic backing, and simply all other options were just inefficient. They did not, you know. So by the creation of local green building codes, you know, this year, 800,000 units of low-income housing were built in Egypt. That's a remarkable kind of pace, but you want to latch onto it, that these buildings have a green building code. So that's one of the most important things. And the government is reaching out to companies. One of them is like mine, to try and get the green building agenda in place. Each one of the Middle Eastern countries is developing its own. There's some very interesting environmental initiatives in Morocco, and in Lebanon, and in Jordan. Now, they've spiked out of a different thing. They've spiked out because they got in trouble, and so they had to act. So the level of urgency was high on the agenda. Egypt is still not there. But we want to raise the agenda, because at the end of the day, we've got a very, very aggressive growth plan, and there are some excellent wins. We just don't want an obstacle in the way. So it's protection. It's, you know, risk mitigation in that sense. And that's how people like myself should pitch it to the government. That's how the private sector needs to pitch. With environmental stuff, it's either politicians and activists, and they're always at each other's throats, and then there's everyone else. And so it needs a little bit of intelligent marketing for it, and it needs to identify the stakeholders and get really just people who are calm about it on the table. You know, being pragmatic about the climate change agenda. But it's there, it's high on the policy, we've achieved signatures, Egypt is communicating its report, and this year we are seeing over £130 million in funds for climate initiatives. It needs to grow. It's never going to be enough, but it's an excellent start this year.
And I want to take this issue one step back, you know, because when we talk about environment, you know, with the level of sophistication that starts talking about, you know, there's so much more that is being done upstream. The subsidy reform in itself, you know, I mean, we had the highest consumption per capita of wheat, of grain, wastage. Wastage is basically wastage of water, wastage of fertilizers, which is wastage of natural gas, which has an environmental impact. So, I mean, cutting the subsidies have been the most dramatic step towards an environmentally sound policy. That's very basic, and it's never seen in the upfront, you know. Changing our energy mix, you know, to 22% by 2025 to renewables, up from 1%, and 45% by 2035, again, is environment, you know.
Egypt's actually the fourth largest user of wind energy in the world.
And it's but look at the statistics, you know. I mean, from fossil fuel that's environmentally detrimental to 45% in another 15 years that will be renewables. This is a platform upon which, you know, you see that there is a policy moving in this direction. Desalination, we never had desalination. Now it is by decree, all coastal areas are going to be desalinated. or else they're going to pay double the amount of money that they're paying. So, I mean, the government is moving by example in one respect, and removing any incentives of subsidies for water or fresh water. So, I mean, what I'm trying to say, you know, that there have been a lot of initiatives, fundamentals, before we get into a higher level of sophistication when it comes to that.
Thank you so much. So we're going to open it up for questions. Right, okay, thank you. We're going to open it up for questions. Please just, like I said, a question, not comment, and I'll try and take them in the order in which they have arrived, okay? Please.
Oh, thank you very much. Michael Kurtzig, retired from the Department of Agriculture, who worked on Middle East, North African agriculture. You all talked about population and the problem of population explosion, apparently, from what I understand what you said. And the question I have is, why is there such a population explosion? And two examples I have. Japan is not having many children. I spoke to a diplomat and I said, why? Very expensive. When the Chinese dropped the one-child policy, we thought there'd be a boom. It's not the case. It's not a boom. Children is very expensive to have. Is it so cheap to have children in Egypt? And do you have the social, health, education, housing services to meet this demand, number one? And number two, for Tariq maybe, I recall years ago that, if my numbers are correct, 80% of Egyptian disposable income was spent on food.
40.
That's, pardon me?
45.
It's now 45. At that time, I think it was 80, so maybe it dropped quite a bit.
On average, yeah.
Pardon me?
On average.
On average, okay. And the other point, I had one more point. What is the situation with per capita income? Is the population eating up all the progress that's being made? And it's a very good discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sarah, maybe you want to answer that.
Hi. So, yeah, actually, before the reforms, it was quite cheap to have children. It's just like that. But we mustn't just dismiss it onto capital. There are inherent cultural aspects in this that come into it. With the current discussion on say, the UN and practitioner field, is that people are not saying it's bad to have too many children. They're just saying it's important to make sure that the quality of life of these children is good. So that's a different language. It aids everyone on the ground to be able to speak the language of, yes, possibly having fewer children gives them more of an opportunity, but it also gives women the choice of not to have this social pressure on them to have 5 or 6 children and then, getting them into the labor force. The tackling of this is in two ways. There's the soft approach, which is to get awareness programs, which is to get NGOs working, which is to get the National Council for Women in Egypt on board to set up these programs and initiatives for social awareness. On the other hand, it is the provision of services, and now that they've done 2 measures, they've increased the age of marriage so that you don't have child marriages. They've introduced nutritional programs into the very poor schools because that draws in very poor people into schools. And education is a right. It's a constitutional right as well. So the way of tackling this huge population is that you're going to have economic reforms, you're going to create awareness, and at the same time you're going to get initiatives to increase that idea. The role of also the religious clerics is important on this front for getting misconceptions. So it's not just cheap, it was just one of these very politically sensitive topics that simply before people were not ready to address this. And now that they are, we're seeing a slowing rate of growth. It's not as slow as we want it to be, but at least we want it to be socially acceptable as much as possible, not enforced in any way, because that's been tried before and it's failed.
So family planning?
Well, family planning, of course there's family planning, it's also for free. So, but the way it's introduced is very difficult. Again, we have to be careful of the cultural diversity in Egypt and the how it's perceived. But people are trying to have less children, and people are moving a lot more as well, and that works into the dynamics of how large a family is and where and how they plan.
Prior to 2011, the growth rate, population growth, was 1.9%. It was quite a successful program that went on for a number of years. Again, like Sarah said, during the time of crisis, there was a population explosion.
Yeah.
So I think, we're more or less retracting again, So this last 7 years were very contentious. And like she says, you can't explain it.
Thank you so much. Sit over in the back.
Good morning. My name is Firas Muadad. I'm from a private company called IHS Markit. I'm wondering about the privatization program and where that is going. And I'm wondering also about your views on the link up between Egypt, Cyprus, Israel when it comes to the gas projects.
Igor, you want to answer?
I can take the gas part and privatization.
Well, privatization, let me tell you about two very significant issues, First of all, like Gerges mentioned, the government is breaking the monopoly in the gas sector, in the railway sector. The Gas Act and the Railway Act, allows private sector to invest, to sell, to distribute, to contribute, and these were a no-touch issue. So, I mean, this is one significant move that shows you where we're heading, or the mindset, It's just breaking the monopolies of the government, and the same is going to happen very soon in the Mining Act that is yet to come out very soon. Now we have 23 IPOs that will be in the market within the coming 2 years, the first of which took place a couple of weeks ago, which is the Eastern Tobacco Company. And this is the first time, where the government is relinquishing majority in a privately held, monopolized company, and it will be weaned from the public sector law to the investment law, basically. So there seems to be a strong appetite, and I can tell you, I've witnessed a meeting with the president about a month ago. He said privatization is not a luxury, it's a necessity, it's a must. So I think we feel quite comfortable, that we're moving in the right direction. Yet, that you have to understand that we're coming out of an era where privatization was a big no-no, a big insult, So we look quite positive about it these days,
On the gas deal, I think it's a slam dunk idea. There is abundance of gas in the Mediterranean. It needs to go somewhere. Israel will not be able to consume it in total. Cyprus is now also discovering, and Egypt has the infrastructure. So why spend billions of dollars making new infrastructures while Egypt has? It just needed a sponsor. And post-2013, I would say the sponsor appeared, who was able to put and sit on the table with all of the stakeholders. So pretty much the first aspect of it is that Israeli gas will be coming from the Leviathan fields through the grids of Egypt up to the liquefaction plants, hence solving the sea gas arbitration as well, and the EMG arbitrations, and exporting the abundance of gas to Europe. So political, economic, and financial slam dunks.
It has more political significance than the act itself, The idea of having a gas hub in collaboration with Israel, Palestinians, Cyprus, and Greece, and it goes through and is actually under implementation without any contention in the political scene is remarkable. This is an issue that wouldn't have been able to touch 10 years ago. And it has more significance, because, again, it's creating a consortium, an economic consortium in the East Mediterranean that has political and geopolitical implications in the area, and upon which, a lot of collaboration and cooperation in industries in this sector, will evolve. So I think it just, again, shows you the mindset of Egypt and where we're heading. A lot of the taboos that have been there for years are being broken day after day.
Now, lady in the front. Oh, thank you. Lady in pink.
I have two questions. One,
Sorry, can you just let us know who you are?
Lamia Elfar. Mr. Abdushaheed talked about the influx of people coming in from the Gulf and spreading some of their ideas in Egypt. I wonder if there's been any studies about the refugees from Iraq and Syria and who've been coming into Egypt and their impact maybe on some of the entrepreneurial activities in Egypt. Another question I have is about the correlation between, democratic reform and increased entrepreneurial activities as well. And is there, what's the scene right now in Egypt as far as that's concerned, because it looks like it's heading backwards as opposed to forwards on the democratic side.
You want me?
Refugees.
Refugees.
Refugees, bear in mind, we don't use the word refugees in Egypt. We have close to 8 million migrants, if you say, who are settling in Egypt, almost permanently. 4 of which are Sudanese, who are almost living there permanently. We never talk about it. The country, anybody who moves to the country is assimilated within the community. Syrians, maybe close to 500,000 Syrians are permanent residents now in the country, and our perception is that they probably won't move back. So the mindset and the culture of the country is very much welcome to whoever comes and stays. And we have this diversity and this ethnic mix since millennia. And it's just part of it. Even when we talk about officials, why don't we capitalize on the situation like Jordan or like Turkey is doing? It's not part of our culture. Everybody comes to Egypt and is more than welcome. So, this explains to you. Entrepreneurial, yes, we have been having a lot of entrepreneurial impact since close to 150 years. Syrians, Lebanese, coming and moving to the country, had a very big impact on arts, culture, journalism, And it's the same case, You go to Cairo right now, and there are Syrian quarters, permanent. Trading, 2,000 Syrian factories has popped up, formal and informal. So, it's a very different culture in the country that accommodates anybody who comes and stays there. So that's when it comes to refugees. When you talk about entrepreneurship and democracy, I have another twist to it, It's very interesting that one of the reasons that had our educational system decay is the idea of promoting that the government is the employer of every single graduate in the country. This has been preached since the 60s. The government right now, so anybody, whether at the same level, anybody holding a PhD, a diploma will probably get on the same entry level. Now the government is not employing anybody. So this has been characterized by more informality, and what we're seeing right now, more entrepreneurship, because any young, bright individual who wants to get a job is not looking for the government like he did before. We had periods where these young kids would stay for 6, 7 years waiting for a governmental job. This is not the case. So it looks like, this shift is prompting a massive entrepreneurial movement in the country, outside the democratic jargon that we talk about, It's just remarkable.
So I will just add very quickly, if I may. Yes, there's been a lot of work, especially in Egypt, on the contribution of refugees to the economy. I worked on one. If you see me afterwards, I'll let you know. And in Egypt, after the problems in Tunisia, Yemen, and Syria, these countries in Egypt, they're entitled to the same subsidies and things that Egyptians are allowed to. Syrian children attend Egyptian public schools for free. They have the same access to education. And that's why Egypt very often doesn't know how many quote-unquote refugees, and there aren't refugee camps, and people largely assimilate. So it's very difficult to tell, who's who. They're not treated like refugees. So, and yes, they do contribute to the economy, like 1.2 billion last year or something. So if you see me afterwards, I'll give you the report. Yeah, sorry. And then there was the gentleman over in there.
Thank you very much. My name is Timur Aladiri. I work with the Netherlands Embassy. I would like to ask a question about the involvement of the military in the economy, especially in two sectors, manufacturing and agriculture. We all know it's a big actor, has ownership in companies, but I'm also interested in its involvement in price setting and the effects that has on investment decisions. So can anyone please go a bit into detail about the trend that we have seen recently? Which way is this going?
Who would like to take this?
Go ahead, sure.
Let me give you an example. There are two things. I'm a small startup, and I do small energy audits, and I'm a green building company. I'm run by women. The military has employed me to create a training program on climate change for some of its people. So this is a small story of the very, very small scale. That's one thing, and they are my client in one sense, which is a very, that's a very broad spectrum of the nature of my company and the established I'm dealing with. I also work with government and also likewise the private sector. That's one thing. The second thing is there is, again, when we're talking about development, there have been lots of projects managed by the military, perhaps not executed on the ground, but managed by the military that have served the development urgency that we were asking about. When it comes to the needs for Egypt and the kind of growth, time is of the essence. And there are some things that were a major hindrance that needed this kind of very fast management. I'm talking about roads and grids for electricity and providing water. So this, in terms of the development spectrum, was not considered an overcrowding or an interference. It was considered actually as an enabler of some sort, and it was delivered. So that's from what has been going on from a development perspective.
Yeah, I can't to agree with Sarah that we have to differentiate between two things, the involvement of the army in infrastructure to circumvent the bureaucracy, to go on a fast track when it comes to roads, bridges, ports, desalination, and so forth. This is very much welcome within the population, because had it gone the other way during this transition, nothing would have been done with the bureaucracy and the corruption that was there. So this is one thing. The second one, is the involvement, like you mentioned, of the army in industry and agriculture. Their presence is almost non-existent, in terms of the scale of operation. But yes, there were several attempts, to get into that. We talk candidly with them about it, that this is not something that we foresee happening on the long run. Their argument has always been, that they are filling in gap to jumpstart and would move out ultimately. But at the end of the day, we quite see that this kind of involvement is not going to work. There is so much knowledge, accumulated knowledge, know-how, and not a single entity will have know-how everywhere. So their contribution, for example, in the cement industry, their factories are running at a low capacity and their contribution is no more than 5-6%. Agriculture, whatever ventures they were in, they basically reclaim the land and they are leasing it to the private sector. They are not the operators. And this is, again, being like an enabler, which is very much welcome from our side. We don't see it as a sustainable trend. We've seen it over the last 3 years. It caught our attention, but realistically speaking, it's not something that we see feasible, even on the short run.
Thank you. Gentlemen in the check shop. You were going to ask the same question. All right. Any other questions? Please.
I'll ask you again, just to follow up. You mentioned cooperation with Israel and desalinization. Israel has made tremendous progress in desalinization. A good chunk of their water is desalinized now. And actually, they're exporting water to Jordan, among other countries. So is there cooperation in that area? And number two, years ago, I'm talking a few years ago, when the first cooperation between Israel and Egypt came about, there was a dairy. My brother was partly involved in a dairy exchange where Israel shipped animals to Egypt. Is that still going on in the development of a dairy industry? Because obviously, with a booming population, you need milk, a lot of milk. know what's
dairy,
happening?
we
Thank you.
are, sorry, let me answer that. Desalination, I'm not quite sure. I know that, you know, Israel is the leading country in desalination. I mean, almost 80% of the water in Israel is desalinated or recycled in one way or the other. I'm not quite sure that this cooperation is there. I don't know. So I mean, in this respect. Dairy, Egypt is self-sufficient in dairy. We have some of the biggest dairy farms. What we are importing is basically cattle to grow, genetic material, but Egypt is self-sufficient in dairy, self-sufficient in poultry, self-sufficient in most basic. The one thing that we're not self-sufficient in is basically grains, which is the cheapest form, you know. And, you know, we take from Israel that they had a smart move 20 years ago when they weaned their agriculture from low-yielding crops into high-value crops, and we are a net exporter of horticulture and a net importer of grain. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Okay, lady in beige.
Hi, good morning. I'm Ashley. I'm from Cardno, and I just have a question, I guess, about the role of SMEs and what the government is doing to communicate that they recognize that SMEs are going to be the force driving growth in the Egyptian economy.
Do you want to take that?
Sure. So, as Tariq mentioned, you know, like at the end of the day, the private sector composition and the contribution to the economy, which is around 60%, and we have to recognize that 90% is based on SMEs. Okay, so there is a lot of measures that are, you know, like legislation reform that's being done right now, like Tariq was mentioning the SME law, which just helps to incentivize. You know, like, and give incentives and breaks for and maybe Girgis can speak about it as well. So this is one. Two, the fact that bringing them in the value chain and the integration of the SMEs in the value chain and linking them in, you know, like with big companies and making sure that they're giving, you know, like they're getting into the export markets and contributing, which is again one of the key growth factors in Egypt, which is the export growth. So this is the second area that we're working on right now. And the role of Federation of Industries as well as the associations like the American Chamber, among others, in doing that is very important as well, which is the integration of the SMEs in the value chain. And the other thing is with the new development that are happening, like the Suez Canal and among other, you know, like clusters that are being developed all over Egypt, there is, again, a special attention that's given to SMEs and how to help them, you know, promote their relocation there and how to help them scale up and expand and introduce, you know, like help them grow and go to market and, you know, like capitalize on such new developments and from a geographical footprint. Again, don't forget the service industries are growing, is one of the fastest growing industries in Egypt as well, and there's a huge potential for the service industries to grow. And this is, again, another SME promoter and another sector that can bring a lot of SMEs to the market. And, you know, like, again, it's one of the fastest growing markets. I don't know, Tariq, if you want to add anything.
I want to add one thing, you know, I mean, in terms of policy formulation for the last 60 years, the government has been going on the wrong track. So they were adopting sectoral policies with a total disconnect. So, I mean, rather than having a value chain approach. And this led to informality because, I mean, bringing into the SMEs, like Dalia said, would have to be more of a demand-driven mechanism through a value chain. It never happened. Now that we are changing the whole narrative to a value chain approach, and bear in mind that one of the biggest bottlenecks in the development of the economy has been the lagging of modernization, the internal trade and logistics. It never took a precedence in that, and this contributed to this informality. Now that we're moving again to a value chain approach, on a demand-driven approach, I mean, the job creation or the opportunities for SMEs to turn from informal to formal is right there. It's going to take a bit of time, but at least, you know, we see it finally moving in the right direction. You know. Again, you know, with the legislative process and the reforms that should more or less pave the way to bring them in line. You know.
Sorry, there's also just a recognition of small companies that achieve the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. So there's an interest in these kind of new companies that look into problem solving, green economies, renewable energy, tech, and there's been recognition of them. Egypt's last national volunteer report was featuring literally just SMEs in that field. So just to recognize that there is more of an appreciation of the different style of companies coming into the market, and that maybe perhaps they don't belong, as Tarek was saying, to a specific sector in that sense, but they are, creating an impact on the horizontal sort of broad spectrum of SME environment.
I recall two initiatives by the government. One is there is a mandate to the banks to lend startups at a maximum of 5% versus the normal 16 or 17% interest for other infrastructure projects, and this is only for SMEs. There's also the initiative by the Ministry of Investment that is called either Fikretak Shirketak or Shirketak Fikretak. Basically, your idea can become a company with the help of the Ministry of Investment. The law has changed, yes, a while back, that you can establish a limited liability company with a capital of 2 Egyptian pounds. And this allows SMEs to have a decent structure with limited liability to the status of the shareholders and become a corporation quite quickly.
Okay, so I have a couple of quick questions. All right. The one is on the IPOs to be offered and what you expect this is going to add, and perhaps you can take that. The other one is perhaps for Sarah and Tariq. Egypt's agricultural section is huge, and what with the current demands on water, it has been that the agricultural sector has been fairly has been fairly wasteful with water. I understand that there are now changes underway to change that. Perhaps we can tackle whichever one you want first.
You can start. Go ahead.
IPO. Go ahead, IPOs.
Okay, the IPO initiative is led by ministers that were in the private sector, that know very well how to IPO a company and actually have IPO'd before. And the current exercise that they're doing is the restructuring of those companies. It has happened a long time ago when Egypt has introduced the public sector or public enterprise companies, but they have realized that this public enterprise structure is not well perceived in the international market. So there is currently the move of changing these public enterprises into private companies in the form of a fully fledged private corporation, and then they will embark in the process of the IPO. I believe the first success story was related to the Eastern Tobacco, which is the manufacturer of tobacco. It was oversubscribed. I thought it would know the numbers. 1.7 times. And I believe that there will be much more coming into play, especially that the stock market internationally as well is doing doing great.
Thank you. Tara and Sarah in 5 minutes.
لا go ahead, sir. Agriculture, agriculture in Egypt historically has been very wasteful. Bear in mind that 70% of water in Egypt is consumed in agriculture with an efficiency of close to 30%. So the glass is still empty or half full. By more or less modernizing irrigation systems with more efficient systems, by having post-harvesting, storage, cold chain. Before doing anything about the water, you can probably save 50% of the water consumed in agriculture. So, this is the biggest challenge. Now that we're moving, and bear in mind that the big chunk of agriculture produce is coming right now from land developed since the 80s and the 90s in the desert, east and west, which has employed a lot of Israeli technology in the 90s, when it comes to modern irrigation systems and best practices, But I think, the Egyptian farming industry on the private sector has graduated and relying less so on Israeli know-how as we speak. What we have right now is that we have another project that is the development of 1.5 million acres in the Western Desert. It's a shareholding company owned primarily by the government or government ministries that is yet to be IPO'd once it goes on track. And this is where you are going to be employing the highest technology when it comes to farming practices, you know. Industry, now let me put it this way, I'll just give you a figure and you can visualize what's happening, you know. To grow tomatoes in open field in Egypt, it will consume 200 liters. To grow it in a greenhouse in...
200 liters per what?
Per 1 kilo of tomatoes. To grow it in a greenhouse in Holland, it consumes 2 liters. So this is where the potential is. To have a very sophisticated greenhouse, state-of-the-art, you know, which is still a bit avant-garde, you probably can use 50% of these 2 liters, you know, and it's economically viable. And this is where we're moving towards, you know. We're not going to go through the normal developmental process of best agricultural practice. We're jump-starting it by employing the latest technology, which is available off the shelf, you know. It's not, I mean, it's not rocket science anymore. So yes, we realize that, but beforehand, like I mentioned, you know, you have to reduce your wastage because we have wastage of 30% of crop produce in the post-harvest. Once you bring it up to the normal level of 5%, this is a hell lot of water saved. And then once you have the best practices in irrigation and have, you can actually double your agricultural output by using the same amount of water. Doing this, and doing that, probably, you know, we can more or less weather the storm of water over the coming decade, you know. And it's doable, and we're seeing it happen, you know.
I think water is a whole other lecture. Thank you so much to the panel. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your insights. Thank you, everyone who joined us. And please come again.
Thank you.